I regretted it quietly, not in a way that demanded attention, and not in a way that asked to be resolved. The regret didn't arrive as a realization. It didn't announce itself with clarity or force. It settled in slowly, almost politely, as if it didn't want to disrupt anything that had already been decided. I noticed it in moments that weren't supposed to carry weight, while doing something routine, while listening without really listening, while moving through a day that looked no different from any other. There was no sharp pain, no clear mistake I could point to, just a faint awareness that something had been misaligned, and that the moment to address it had already passed. I regretted it quietly, because nothing about the situation invited correction anymore. The choice had been made. The opportunity had closed without ceremony. There was no obvious way back, no natural point where revisiting it would make sense. So the regret didn't turn outward. It stayed contained, unexpressed, unshared. From the outside, nothing suggested that anything was wrong. The decision still looked reasonable. The outcome still functioned as expected. No one questioned it, which made the regret easy to dismiss. If it had mattered that much, I told myself, surely it would have felt louder. But regret doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it lowers it. It becomes something you carry rather than confront, something you adjust around instead of examine. I regretted it quietly, because acknowledging it openly would have required explanation, and explanation would have reopened a moment that had already been sealed by time and consensus. It would have asked people to revisit assumptions they no longer remembered making. It would have required me to admit that the certainty I had shown at the time was incomplete. So I kept the regret contained. Not hidden exactly, just unspoken. There's a difference. Unspoken regret doesn't disappear. It just learns how to coexist with everything else. It doesn't interfere with daily functioning. It doesn't interrupt conversation. It doesn't demand immediate action. It sits alongside your decisions and quietly observes the ones that follow. I noticed how it altered my pace, how it made me hesitate slightly longer before reaching the same conclusions again. Not enough for anyone else to notice, just enough for me to feel it. The regret wasn't about the outcome. The outcome was fine. It was about the process, about how easily I had arrived at the decision, how little resistance there had been between doubt and closure. I regretted it quietly, because the regret itself didn't feel justified. Nothing catastrophic had happened. No one had been harmed. The situation hadn't deteriorated, which made the feeling difficult to defend. Even to myself. What do you do with regret? When everything still works, you can't point to damage. You can't argue necessity. You can't demand reversal. All you can do is acknowledge that something internal didn't align with how smoothly things moved on. I told myself that regret was indulgent, that revisiting past choices without a clear path forward was unnecessary. So I didn't revisit them. But not revisiting isn't the same as resolving. The regret remained quiet, but it didn't remain passive. It shaped how I approached similar moments later, how cautious I became about closing things too quickly, how sensitive I was to the subtle signs that I might be choosing ease over accuracy again. I realized then that quiet regret isn't about wanting to undo the past. It's about recognizing that you learned something without announcing that learning to anyone else. It doesn't change what happened. It changes how you stand in the next moment. I regretted it quietly, because expressing it would have turned it into something else. Spoken regret invites response, advice, reassurance, correction. But this regret didn't want to be fixed. It wanted to be noticed. There's a kind of regret that exists only as internal calibration. It doesn't ask for forgiveness. It doesn't seek validation. It simply adjusts your sense of weight. What deserves more attention? What deserves less? I began to understand that some regrets are not signals to act, but signals to observe. They don't point backward. They refine forward motion. Still, there were moments when the quietness felt heavy, when I wondered whether silence was just another way of avoiding discomfort, whether keeping regret contained was actually a continuation of the same pattern that had caused it in the first place. Letting things pass, not interrupting, maintaining smoothness. That thought lingered longer than the regret itself. I regretted it quietly, but I didn't ignore it. I let it remain present, without demanding resolution. That was new. In the past, I would have tried to reframe it immediately, to justify it, to neutralize it. This time, I allowed it to exist as incomplete, Not every feeling needs to be settled. Not every realization needs to be shared. Some of them are meant to stay internal, not as secrets, but as reference points. I don't regret the decision itself. Not exactly. What I regret is how little attention I gave the moment before it closed. The speed of certainty, the comfort of alignment, the relief of not complicating things. I regretted it quietly, because the regret wasn't meant to change the past. It was meant to slow the future. And in that sense, it mattered more than I initially thought. The world didn't notice. Nothing required correction. Everything continued without interruption, which is why the regret stayed with me. Not as pain, not as guilt, just as awareness.